Well, today I'm joined by Julian Disney, who is the chair of the Australian Press Council. Professor Disney has a background in welfare and public law, and he's going to talk with us today about the Press Council, its operations and its relevance. Welcome, Julian.
Thanks.
Well, first up, can you just explain briefly your role as chair and what the Press Council does?
Yeah, well, as chair, it's about a half-time position, so I'm meant to sort of oversee and lead the general work of the council. The council's got a number of public members like myself who are not from the media, so it's got a reasonable degree of independence. Only about 40% are actually nominated by industry. I think the council's main value at the moment is that it's quite a good way of handling complaints from people who don't have the means to use a lawyer, but who do have cases or concerns that need to be addressed. We don't cost them anything, and we negotiate directly with the newspaper. So that's one of its main uses. I think it can be useful, although we haven't done this enough yet, in developing standards of practice, specifying how we feel that the media should behave in particular circumstances. We've done that over the years, but I think we need to do it better.
So the Press Council we describe as a self-regulatory body because it's actually funded by industry, isn't it? And it's an alternative to people pursuing legal action over media indiscretions, particularly those from newspapers or the former newspapers or online publishers.
Yes, we do. I tend to prefer to call it independent than self-regulatory, but it is funded by industry entirely at the moment. But as I say, they're not in the majority and they don't appoint the chair, for example, or others. I wouldn't want to overstate its independence because there obviously are significant influences and pressures from the media. But on the other hand, I don't regard us as a body that the industry owns and that we should do what the industry tells us. So it's a bit of a hybrid.
Well, over the past few years, there have been major national inquiries into the media and its regulation because of misbehaviour, particularly that emanating from the UK. And I know the British Press Council came under a lot of criticism in the wake of the Leveson report inquiry, and during that. In here we had the Finkelstein inquiry, and you were very active there, and there was also criticism of the Australian Press Council there. So would you mind explaining what makes the Press Council relevant in this era?
Well, I think it is mainly the complaints handling work at the moment. It already does a moderately useful job for people of modest means. I think it needs to do better in that area, but I think it can, and we've got more resources now to try to do that. Mainly we need to do better in that we need to be able to move more quickly, and perhaps to be less timid than we've been sometimes. We're not totally toothless though. It's sometimes said we're toothless, and I don't think that's quite right, in that as the person who mainly has to field the criticisms from the editors of our adjudications, I know that they certainly don't just regard them as unimportant. They get sometimes very stirred up if they don't like what we've said. But I think sometimes perhaps we've been a little bit too timid. But I think the most important work really of the Council is actually more forward-looking and proactive, which is not just to react to complaints, because it's very haphazard really as to whether major errors are complained about. There are all sorts of reasons why people won't complain about them. But to look more towards setting standards, spelling out what we regard as the minimum acceptable practice really, in a whole number of areas and fairly specifically. And that's what we're starting to do now. We've done it in relation to reporting of suicide. We're about to do it in relation to access to patients. We'll do some soon on particular things to do with digital publishing. And I think that'll be more useful. And in some areas, they'll be really welcomed by publications, because the dominant factor at the moment, probably in this situation at the moment, is of course the pressure arising from the advent of the internet, the competitive pressure, and part of that is the arrival now of the international publishers like The Guardian and the Daily Mail. That's really put the wind up local publishers, and there is a risk of a race to the bottom in terms of standards and of people feeling they have to compete with pretty quick and dirty operations. And so some of them actually would be quite welcoming of standards to help protect them. And that's a thing that happens in a lot of industries and professions, that often they come together and say there are too many shysters in our industry or profession, and we want to try and set up some decent standards and indicate to the public who are the people who've agreed to comply with those standards, and to a credible system for dealing with complaints.
I recall during the Finkelstein inquiry that I think you floated the notion that there could indeed be a single regulator or co-regulator or self-regulator looking after both broadcast and print and online media. Do you still hold that view, or do you think things have changed?
No, well, they've changed, but it makes it even more important, I think, to move in the direction we were talking about. I don't mean by that there would be, uniform, detailed standards which were the same for all platforms, but it would be regulation that, in a sense, is under one roof, so that there's consistency unless there's a clearly identified need for difference, and where there wasn't as much territoriality as one might get otherwise. But I think with every passing, I was going to say year, but things move so fast, every passing month, the need to work on these things together across the different platforms becomes greater. And the public need that help, because increasingly something that's written that they may not like will also crop up in so many other platforms, and there needs to be some way of trying to redress the problem across those platforms if it has occurred in each of them.
Probably the best known ethical code is actually the Journalists' Code of Ethics in Australia, but it seems to be hardly enforced at all, and the Journalists' Union, the MEAA, or the Media Alliance, is actually part of the Press Council process now. Has the Press Council's principles and that process really replaced the Media Alliance process?
Well, the Media Alliance did ask us 2 or 3 years ago whether we would take over their complaints handling process. We felt that we couldn't. We were keen to do it, but there are a couple of problems. One is their code is different from ours, not necessarily inconsistent, but different. But also they deal with complaints against journalists, whereas we very deliberately regard it as the publisher's responsibility, because after all the journalist may well not have written the headline or the first paragraph or decided where it was put in the newspaper, etc., etc. So we're quite rigorous in saying that we sheet home the responsibility of the publisher, and MEAA, the Alliance, does it with the journalist. So I think what will probably happen, but it's sort of in decision-making stage right now, is that they will do even more than they have in the past, refer people who come to them to think about bringing the complaint to us. I think that will be the case. Their code is expressed in, I think it would be fair to say, more general best practice aspirational terms than ours. So ours is deliberately saying this is what we regard as minimum acceptable practice. So in other words, if you don't meet these principles in our code, then we will uphold a complaint against you. Whereas the MEAA plays, I think it's a very useful adjunct, which is sort of best practice, the really aspirations that journalists should have.
Your principles talk about freedom of the press as being a fundamental right, and that underpins a lot of what you do. I remember the Press Council used to be much more proactive in defending press freedom, and these days it seems to focus much more on its complaints handling role. What's the reason for this?
Well, of course, really the underlying freedom that we should be concerned about is freedom of expression, and that's what the preamble to our principles has said for a long time, maybe the whole life of the Council, I'm not sure. It said that freedom of press gets its justification from the need for freedom of expression and access to information. And so one of the concerns we've had is that if newspapers are not providing their readers with reliable information and not providing them with a diversity of views, and if they're, for example, intimidating people through the way in which articles are written, then all those things are actually hurting freedom of expression. Because if, for example, you express views which would not be the views you'd express if you'd been accurately informed, then your freedom of expression has, in practical terms, been damaged. So we are very keen on the importance of freedom of expression, but we're trying to emphasise that side of it. And incidentally, Hilary Mantel, the famous novelist, has said pretty much exactly the point recently in the UK that media bullying, for example, can be a serious constraint on freedom of expression. But we are still concerned about the sort of more traditional approach of freedom of the press, but frankly there's been so much work to do in other areas, and also we do tend to feel that we should focus on those areas where we're really the only ones who have the responsibility to do it, handling the complaints and developing the standards. There are strong forces in different parts of society, including the media, that are pursuing freedom of the press, and in a world where we've got very few resources in terms of concentrating on those areas of greatest need, we've tended to take that view. Also, some of the great battles of freedom of information, defamation, privacy, etc., were fought quite a lot 4, 5, 6 years ago, that sort of period, and they're perhaps coming back onto the agenda again now, but for a few years there hasn't been a lot of government inquiries and that sort of thing. We tend to be, what we did in the past was mainly make submissions to government inquiries on those issues, and there haven't been as many of them on some of that as there have been in the last few years. But we are also wanting to get across that broader view of what freedom of expression really means, and that absolute freedom of expression can actually hinder freedom of expression. And there's a very good example of that right now with what's happening with comment streams on newspaper websites, because by contrast with 4 or 5 years ago, editors are actually opening very few of them. That's partly because the resources required to moderate them, but it's also because they're finding that so much of the material they get on the comment streams is what they regard as damaging to their brand, and also can be very high risk from the point of view of defamation. So we're finding that the abuse of, what I'd call the abuse of the freedom of expression on comment streams, from the worst forms of troll, etc., has actually deprived other people of freedom of expression. For example, one editor said to me, I would never open a comment stream on issues to do with Penny Wong's child, because I would get such a appalling lot of stuff that it would be very bad for the newspaper. Well, that means that people who might have a perfectly a view that they should be entitled to express, as long as they do it civilly, whether you or I might agree with it, it's irrelevant. They've been deprived of their ability to express concern, say, about the issues involved there because of the excessive abuse of other people. So it's really true with most freedoms that, all freedoms actually, that absolute freedom destroys the freedom you're talking about. It needs to be balanced with other things.
All right, well, good luck with your deliberations, and thanks for spending a few minutes with Journal Law today.
Good, thank you.